All right, it is finally time to talk about PSVR2 and the current state of this headset right now based on a very alarming news story from Android Central, where the headline reads, Sony no longer cares about the PSVR2, and neither should you. This story came out about 3-4 days ago, right before LTPS last Friday, which I did see at the time, but this is a good moment to remind viewers that when it comes to LTPS or the channel overall, I cover PlayStation for a living, so I see nearly everything. There's not much that gets past me. So it is one of those things where I looked into it. It read very inaccurate to me, or certain things didn't really line up, and at least with PSVR 2 nowadays, a lot of it did read almost like a hit piece. Not exactly like a hit piece in a way where it's exactly that. There's a lot of valid criticisms in the article, but just certain things did not really line up, so it was a judgment call of not including it in LTPS, because that is what we'll do, right? LTPS can obviously get into rumor, speculation, and all that good stuff, but I'm not going to give all this attention to every single sensational headline or rumor or 4chan leak that pops up. I just think that's not responsible for the audience. So we try to do due diligence on all the stories that we talk about for LTPS, and this one just did not make the cut, and I thought that's kind of where this thing was going to end up. However, a lot of places were sharing this around. It seemed to gain traction, and now it looks weird that I'm not talking about it, obviously, so let's at least acknowledge it, and use it as a good springboard for discussing the current state of PSVR 2. We are certainly due to do that. So, the actual article itself and what we're hearing. So, sources have told Android Central that Sony is making deep cuts to funding for VR games and that there will be very few opportunities for VR game development at Sony going forward. And apparently, another source says that they only have 2 PSVR 2 games in development right now within the company, or at least at Sony is how the article is phrasing it exactly. The author of this report, Nicholas Sutrich, I think that's how you pronounce their name. I apologize deeply if I got that wrong. But they then refer to the Insomniac breach and how we know Insomniac has no VR games in development, despite them having shipped well-received games for Oculus during their independent stint. Those games were good, but the author then writes, and I quote here, yet Sony has them working on exactly 0 PSVR 2 games, trying to make a point there. They then refer to First Contact Entertainment and Firewall Ultra, which was a PlayStation Studios second-party game. That developer shut down due to the lack of a big VR audience. Then Firesprite, that studio was acquired back in 2021. They were primarily a VR studio in a sense that they had released the Air Force VR experience for PSVR 1, then the Persistence that was in VR first, then 2D, and then of course the PSVR 2 launch game Horizon Call of the Mountain, which after that, as far as we know, they were not doing any other VR projects before the layoffs that hit the company, as the article mentions, because they were a part of the layoffs from the company-wide layoffs that SIE did. And really, that was something where, as far as we know, that probably did affect primarily the canceled Twisted Metal game that was handed over from Lucid Games, because that game did not survive the recent culling of Sony's portfolio. So you got to figure that's probably where a lot of people did go if they were, if they had people to spare, obviously, considering that game did not make it. But anyway, the other studio they mention is London Studio, and they were SIE's more experimental, casual entertainment studio. They were doing for 10 plus years Buzz, SingStar, iCreate, iPad, all those kind of games up until, PSVR Worlds and Blood and Truth. They were shut down, although this is something where we know they were shut down while they were working on a 2D fantasy London live service game, which honestly is more of a consequence of simply like opportune timing on Sony's end. I hate how this is how it worked out, but they just started that game in like mid to late 2022. It might have been a little bit before, even closer to when PSVR 2 ended up shipping. It was clearly a decision pretty early on they were going to be going to 2D instead, but trying to work on a 6-7 year newly established IP that's unproven in the live service space. Clearly, Sony was like, okay, we'll maybe nip this in the bud now, shut the studio down, and just go for that quick and dirty fix on the balance sheet for, what were company layoffs and closing down a studio, right? I hate how that worked, but that's primarily what happened there. But these are all, VR studios to a degree, so the article mentions these ones. And right away, this is where it's not really lining up for me when they say Sony has 2 PSVR 2 games in development, and they say only 2 VR games. The shocking thing is that that's 2 more than I would have thought. Right? But it really depends on, I guess, how they're phrasing this. They say at Sony, which would be first-party studios, in-house studios. But Sony only has 15 studios that actually make and ship their own games, and there's really no room, as far as we know, within PlayStation Studios where that would even take place. Like, we've gone over PS Studios many times in terms of a, sort of portfolio review, what kind of games we can expect based on rumors and speculation. There's still a lot of studios that, yes, in theory, we don't officially know what they're doing, but we would have very good indicators with rumors and things over time that they're working on VR experiences. We have no expectations from direct first-party studios that they're making any sort of virtual reality games or even VR modes for those games, right? So, if it's that what they're referring to when VR games are at Sony, that doesn't line up. That's inaccurate. But if they're referring to PlayStation Studios overall, this umbrella that now encompasses, second and third-party games, and that is ideally what I would expect from PSVR2 development or Sony's involvement with funding PSVR2 games, then that would be accurate, and 2, I think, would line up with about what the company is probably aiming to do. I wouldn't expect some sort of really insane, aggressive 6, 7, 10 plus PS Studio titles from all these second-party studios, although I would like that. Yes, that's very much the case, because I want to make clear too, right? This is something where, as far as PSVR 2 goes, I am very much in agreement with most people when it comes to where this headset is right now, which is not a very good position, although I'm always of the mind where it's because of a different thing and not necessarily all these other angles that people like to prop up, like this article, for example. But with that in mind, that's the one portion that didn't really make a whole lot of sense. That, and I'm also referring to Insomniac Games, where they said, yet Sony doesn't have them making a PSVR 2 games. That doesn't make sense either. I mean, Sony, and we've known this for a long time, but their studios have their own agency. They're allowed to experiment, do their own things, pitch ideas, and they have their own internal corporate structure where they can, see through ideas and try and come up with their own things. If they want to make VR games, in theory, I don't see why they would not be able to. I would presume that a lot of the studios simply just don't want to do VR, although I would absolutely make the counter argument and play the devil's advocate of, if Naughty Dog, Sucker Punch, even Insomniac, if they did say, hey, we want to put out this big, massive AAA PSVR 2 game that would not at all probably make a ton of money and just be financially more of a sunken cost fallacy, right, where they could instead be doing their standard single-player AAA games for PlayStation 5 2D standard, where those games are going to ship 5, 10 plus million units, I have no doubt in my mind Sony would step in and say, please don't do that. But if they wanted to do a separate team or do a VR mode or something, I don't see why Sony would not allow that. We know that PlayStation Studios, historically, they have their own agency. They're allowed to, go through with their own unique ideas and projects. And obviously Sony is the parent company. They do step in when they have to, and that leads to cancellations or studio shutdowns, so obviously that happens. But in terms of ideas and getting games off the ground, I don't see why they would not be able to humor certain VR experiences if they did want to. So that doesn't really make sense either. But anyway, that kind of ties into the next point they bring up, which is Astrobot. So talking about its lack of a VR mode, which they straight up say Team Asobi's studio head, Nicolas Duché, gave a disingenuous answer. They're calling Nicholas out about how he mentioned that the game was designed only for TV from the ground up, and how VR modes are, more applicable to first-person games or racing, right? So apparently that answer was disingenuous. And the counter argument for that is how we have plenty of community developers and modders that can do these 2D games and convert them into VR, and there's plenty of projects that very much do that. It's a very cool thing to see. Even PlayStation Studio games on PC get that treatment, so it very much does happen, but I'm not sure that's the argument that really holds up long term, when it's very similar to the whole emulation thing as well, right? That has been going on for a long time, which is, why do the platform holders not do more emulation? Why doesn't Sony just get the RPCS3 guys, or how can they not figure it out, right? So it's the same kind of argument where the second you have to monetize something, there's just all these other variables that come into play, which is the business side of things, right? I mean, it's very easy to have a bunch of hobbyists sort of tool around and come up with something that is playable, say 80-90% of the time, but the other 10%, like a platform holder, is never going to ship a game like that. They want the game to be as stable and, all packaged up as much as it can possibly be. So in the case of VR, it's a matter of worrying about field of view, locomotion, out of bounds areas. I mean, there's just so many avenues where that could get tricky really fast if the game does not have that in mind from the ground up. I mean, this is also very documented across various sort of GDC panels and things like that. I mean, as far as I know, for VR development, for the longest time, it's always been, obviously conversions can happen. In some games, it's a lot easier than others, but for a lot of titles, the best VR games, they are made as VR from the ground up. So as much as we can often get PR answers that are saving face, right, for what might be a question that's going to upset an audience, this is one where I find Nicholas is probably being very truthful, especially given the game's been in development for like 3-something years, right? It probably was something where it was a conscious decision right from the get-go. We're just going to be doing 2D, and I'm not happy about that. Obviously, I would like the VR mode, but that goes into our other portion of this article. So they also talk about the rumor we had 2 years ago about Sony possibly going for a hybrid, 2D VR AAA approach. So the report says games like Horizon, Uncharted, The Last of Us, Spider-Man, these could be VR modes, but obviously we did not get any. We only got Resident Evil Village 4 and Gran Turismo, which going back to the original rumor from 2 years ago, no games were ever listed. It was simply a matter of, that might be an approach Sony is planning on taking, which in practice we did see the 3 games. I guess there's a bit of a disconnect on what the expectation was. At least for me personally, 2 years ago, I was not expecting to see all major first party IP get the VR treatment, especially given the nature of some of those games. I just not at all was expecting that. Not to say this person is wrong for expecting that. Arguably, one should be expecting a lot of support for PSVR 2 from first party, but that's probably where the disconnect is. There was no universe in my head where we were going to get all these hybrid VR games across first party studios. As far as I understand about game development, the business, what would financially make sense, what Sony would probably want to do, there was just no world where that was going to happen. In my head, what I always argue is that Sony should be investing in just VR studios overall, which that's where we can get into where PSVR 2 is overall, because quite frankly, it has a very bad, poor reputation. I'm in complete agreement with most people in that this thing is probably not doing all that well. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say it's doing great, everybody's wrong, this, that, and the other. I'm always mindful of how this is a PlayStation channel. I never want to have it come off as though I'm always defending Sony or something. I very much believe this thing is in trouble, but I find it's in trouble for different reasons compared to all these other complaints that are typically associated with PSVR 2. That primarily being, the obvious suspects like the price. Oh, it's $550-something more than a PS5. You need a PS5, so people give it $1,000+ price tag, which the sort of safer expectation is that it's a very nice headset for an existing PlayStation 5 owner, so you really are looking at $550 to go in. But either way, there's that. There's also the wire. People don't like, and understandably, there's no backwards compatibility. That sucks too. But the thing is, right, I think you solve all those things, that's not going to fix PSVR 2. It's just not. You get rid of all these problems, and also the software problem that I'll tell you right now isn't nearly as bad as people make it out to be, because we have to remind ourselves here, it's only been over a year. Over a year of PSVR 2. So we're not even at year 3 yet having this conversation. It's over a year, and we technically do have a ton of games. We have Horizon, GT7, RE4, RE Village, No Man's Sky. Those are straight bangers right off the top in year 1. Then there's also Synapse and Tales from Galaxy's Edge and Moss Book 2, that Metro game. There's Skydance's Behemoth, which showed up during State of Play, because Sony still debuts PSVR 2 games quite often during their own presentations, which people don't like because people don't like VR. That is the actual problem. The problem with PSVR 2 is it's a virtual reality headset. This very video is going to have comments saying VR is a gimmick. That is not a PSVR 2 problem. That's a VR problem. That's the simple reality of it. All these tech companies, right? Sony, Meta, which Meta's losing billions off virtual reality. They are eating it straight down the throat because they're investing a ton into VR, because they want to be the technology leader in that space because VR potentially has a lot of upside. We just have no idea when that's going to happen. Apple also entering the space with obviously a very low volume sort of halo product to a degree, but I think you understand my point. A lot of different tech companies understand there is massive upside to getting in on the ground floor, being established, and trying to be that market leader on a market that really isn't much of a thing just yet. Sony is in the same place. I think you fix every problem PSVR 2 has, and it's not really going to move the needle. Because people just don't, people are not fired up for VR. We just had a Batman game get announced in VR, and hey, that in theory sounds amazing, right? But no, actually the big complaint is that that game's only in VR. So I think PSVR 2 has a VR problem. And for a lot of these companies, it's really hard to, adjust the timing on these things, right? Because at a certain point, virtual reality, it is here to stay. It's going to be here for a long time. VR, AR, it's all going to be the sort of mixed reality in 20, 30 years. Who knows? Nobody does. But at a certain point, somebody is going to capture that market when it becomes a substantial big thing. And Sony historically has always been very bad at this. They release a lot of experimental technology straight up as consumer-facing features that you can actually use, right? Like remote play on PlayStation 3 back in 2006, which is insane. It was completely unusable, but you could do it. So it's trying to time these things, and it's very easy for somebody else to swoop in, do it right, or take the kind of capital that it would need and make it so much more better than what Sony was doing back in 2022, for example, right? I don't know. That's just kind of where the rant goes. Like, PSVR 2, I think, is very much a compelling headset. It actually had a very good first year in terms of compelling software. It does have some very fair drawbacks, having no backwards compatibility. The wire is certainly a pain. That PC adapter is kind of bogus, given that it seems a bit steep and you're losing all the primary functions that make PSVR 2 very attractive to a potential PC VR player. So by all means, this thing has problems, but I simply do not abide to the problems. Like, that's what's keeping PSVR 2 from being successful, is all those things. I think it's still very much a VR market issue. Now, with all that in mind, where do we go from here? And like I said, I'm in complete agreement. This thing, it ain't looking good. Sony would not do the PC adapter if it was not a case of like what we saw from the 2023 business segment briefing, where it seemed very clear they are not keeping up with the sales pace of PSVR 1. Those lines were going to converge, and this thing probably is not doing all that well. They're not making any additional units as far as I know. Production's probably very slow. Like, that's the fundamental issue. And VR needs just a lot of quality games from anywhere, and that's going to be primarily third-party. This thing could thrive off third-party games just fine for 7, 8 something years for its entire life cycle. It does not need like this crazy exclusivity. You should be judging this thing on just really good software support and the headset itself, obviously, and hopefully it pricing down over time and it being very accessible for console VR. There's a lot of things to this that doesn't necessarily have to abide by, sort of standard tried and true exclusivity in the console space. Like, VR is a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing. Every VR studio needs to ship all their games on all VR platforms, and they all need to be sustainable and make money selling these games. And there has to be a marketplace here that is sustainable and enjoyable for everybody involved. Obviously, Meta can just keep eating money for the foreseeable future. And that's a play that they want to stick with, obviously. My doubts with Sony, I don't think they're going to stick around with, really courting a lot of third parties and doing more, like, you could do incubation programs like the China Hero and India Hero project, and, just do that. Just go out and scout third parties and just try to get them on PSVR 2. I don't need the PlayStation Studios exclusivity to a degree, but I don't know. Maybe I'm in the minority on that one. That's how I feel for VR. I think VR does need to be judged differently from every other sort of facet of how we normally expect these things to go. But with that in mind, I'll close it here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.